I was born in the summer of 1942 in a little cabin perched on stilts at the edge of the Okefenokee Swamp in southern Georgia. A world of cypress knees and water so dark you could almost taste its cool, earthy tang. Back then, our family's life was defined by the rhythms of the land: dawn light slipping through Spanish moss, the steady lilt of Daddy's shotgun as he coaxed catfish from muddy banks, and the soft crackle of sweetgrass baskets as Mama wove them beneath the wide porch eaves. There was a comfort in that simplicity, a sense that the swamp itself provided exactly what we needed: fish, for supper game for winter stores, and a garden patch that yielded enough tomatoes and okra to fill the larder. We weren't rich, hardly, but we were rich in a kind of self-reliance that felt as natural as the swamp's own breathing. In some ways, life there wasn't so different from the coal-mining hollows of Appalachia. I've heard tell of families in West Virginia, children climbing out of bunkhouses at first light to pick blackberries, fathers exchanging chunks of coal for milk and bread, mothers patching quilts under kerosene lamp glow. Both places knew isolation. The swamp's thick canopy swallowed sound, just as the mountain ridges hid winding roads. You learned early that help might be days away, that whatever you needed, you had better be prepared to provide it yourself. And that shared struggle, that collective faith in one another's labor, stitched communities together, even when the world beyond seemed a distant rumor. Daddy's small bait and tackle shop stood at the head of our boardwalk, a hand-hewn structure, bristling with fishing poles, mason jars of grasshoppers, and the faint scent of damp canvas. He'd set out before dawn in his rusty John boat, trolling the murky channels where alligators lurked like driftwood. By mid-morning, he'd return with buckets of bluegill and stringers of catfish, selling them to the few tourists brave enough to venture into our corner of Charlton County. Mama's work was quieter, but no less vital. She gathered sweetgrass from nearby hammocks, coiling it into baskets so finely woven that even the general store clerk in Folkestone marveled at her skill. Those baskets paid for kerosene and sugar, and the occasional bolt of floral feed-sack cloth to brighten our cabin's windows. I still remember as a child how proud I felt when I tagged along to Mama's weaving spot. She'd let me sit on an upturned bucket while she plaited each strand with practiced fingers, humming old spirituals my grandfather taught her. In those moments, the swamp seemed a kindly guardian, its shady groves a cradle for our family, its muddy banks a treasure trove for our livelihood. I could not have imagined then that the same waters would one day witness our deepest suffering. But there's something universal in rural hardship. I've since met descendants of a Louisiana fishing family whose patriarch hauled in shrimp along the Gulf Coast. They spoke in hushed tones of the 1940s shrimp recession, when wartime rationing and fuel shortages threatened their very way of life. Their grandmother, born just a year before me, learned to mend nets under hurricane-lit skies, patching tiers with twine scavenged from abandoned crab traps. Their story echoed mine: the reliance on natural bounty, the pride in honest day's work, and the unspoken understanding that no one outside your own kin truly shared your challenges. In every bayou and swamp and mountain hollow, families like ours weathered the storms, both literal and metaphorical, through sheer perseverance. This early life taught me that resilience is born from necessity. When you have no electricity and the nearest paved road is 20 miles away, you find creative solutions. Rainwater cooled in wooden barrels, basement-rooted vegetables keeping through mild winters, neighbors trading preserves for firewood. You find joy in small miracles. A pair of painted buntings at dawn, fireflies lighting a summer dusk, the first fiddle notes drifting across a churchyard revival. And yet that same necessity can blind you to suffering that creeps in slowly. When everyone you know has tasted hard times, You learn to wear pain like a uniform, invisible, expected, never questioned. Here lies the pitfall: we can romanticize tough childhoods without acknowledging the hidden trauma they often mask. For every sweetgrass basket that fetched a fair price, there could be a bruise hidden under long sleeves. For every successful hunt, there might be a father's howling anger muffled by the swamp's hush. The very isolation that forged our strength also became a prison wall, muffling our cries and teaching us to normalize hardship as a rite of passage rather than a call for help. Looking back, I realize now that my family's pre-war life in the Okefenokee swamp bestowed two gifts: a deep-rooted sense of self-reliance and an almost sacrificial loyalty to privacy. We believed our struggles were ours alone to bear. But there is a balance to be struck between independence and interdependence. The lesson I wish someone had taught me then is this: it's noble to work hard and endure, but it's wiser still to recognize when endurance becomes destructive silence. As the war loomed on the horizon, that silence would be challenged in ways none of us could anticipate. My father, like many young men of his generation, would answer the call in 1943 and return home in 1945. With more than just memories of foreign lands, he carried shadows in his mind that would change our little community forever. But before those shadows fell, there was comfort in the ritual of daily life: the clack of wooden spoons against tin bowls at supper, the lullaby whisper of marsh winds through open windows, and the shared laughter of 5-year-old me chasing tadpoles at the water's edge. Those rhythms would anchor me in the years to come, long after the storm clouds gathered. And so, as the world beyond the swamp accelerated into conflict, our family remained anchored in the quiet promise of the Okefenokee's embrace. It was here, amid cypress knees and frog choruses, that I first learned what it meant to be part of something larger than myself, even before I understood that something larger could sometimes hurt as much as it healed. That delicate duality of sanctuary and secrecy would shape every choice I made in the decades to follow. With the drums of war growing louder on the wind, our story was about to veer into darker territory. But before we venture down that path, it's important to remember what was at stake: the fragile beauty of a life built by honest labor, the quiet dignity of a mother's woven baskets, and a daughter's unwavering belief that home was where resilience took root. In the next part of our journey, we will cross the threshold from peace into chaos, witnessing how a father's return from war can shatter both hearts and hearths, and how the lessons of that simple swamp life would become the very foundation for survival. When Daddy stepped off the transport plane in early 1945, his uniform creased, but his eyes clouded. None of us could have known how much he had changed. He had fought in the Pacific, they told me, island hopping through heat and gunfire. But to me, he returned as a stranger, carrying invisible wounds. At first, his distance was little more than a shadow behind his familiar smile. He sat at our dinner table but seldom spoke, his laughter gone quiet under a weight we didn't name. I would later learn that what he felt, what so many veterans of that era felt, was post-traumatic stress, a condition so poorly understood that most men simply called it shell shock, or the shakes, then soldiered on alone. In the weeks after his return, Daddy's sleeping patterns unraveled. He'd wake in the dead of night, eyes darting in panic, and stumble outside, clutching his pistol, convinced enemy soldiers were creeping through the darkness. Mama tried to calm him with soft words and cool cloths on his forehead, but the nightmares only grew fiercer, fueled by memories of jungle patrols and lost friends. In rural Georgia in 1945, the word PTSD didn't exist. There was no VA outreach, no counseling hotline, no understanding that what haunted him was a wound as real as any bullet. Alcohol became Daddy's refuge. It started innocently moonshine from old man Jenkins's hidden still a sip on restless nights to chase away the ghosts. But like many who self-medicate with a bottle, his reliance deepened into dependency. By summer's end, the ritual was daily a flask slipped into his shirt pocket before he set out for the swamp, another waiting on the table when he tracked home at dusk. Today, we recognize the Patton veterans without proper support, turning to opioids or alcohol to numb overwhelming pain. In fact, a 2017 study by the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism noted that rural veterans are up to 50% more likely to develop substance use disorders than their urban counterparts, haunted not just by their service, but by isolation and lack of resources. As the shine's acrid tang settled into our cabin's corners, its presence grew menacing. The first blow came one humid July evening when the air felt thick enough to slice with a knife. I was hiding under the floorboards, my 8-year-old heart pounding in time with the distant thunder. Mama was kneeling by our milk pails, churning butter for the general store order, when I heard Daddy's boat engine sputter and die at the dock. He slung that bottle onto the porch rail like a harpoon, and then I heard it before I understood a crack like a broken tree limb, followed by Mama's strangled cry. She sank to the floorboards beside me, her apron blossoming red. Domestic abuse in the 1950s South was rarely spoken of outside these walls. Neighbors might whisper about a domestic disturbance, but most believed what happens at home stays at home. I've seen a 1954 Charlton County Sheriff's log that lists dozens of alcohol-related calls, half of them dismissed as unfounded, because no witnesses would testify. Shame, fear of reprisal, and a community code of silence all conspired to protect abusers. A battered wife was expected to keep her pain hidden under long sleeves. A frightened child learned to lie about bruises, claiming she'd slipped off the porch or fallen from a tree. Yet even as Daddy's bottle emptied day by day, I saw that the alcohol was merely a catalyst, an accelerator for a violence rooted in unspoken trauma and rigid ideas of masculinity. In 2020, Dr. Marcus Hall, a psychologist specializing in military mental health, explained alcohol doesn't cause domestic violence, it disinhibits the underlying rage and fear. A man with untreated PTSD may use violence to regain a sense of control when he feels powerless. In Daddy's case, his war-scarred psyche clashed with his role as head of the family. He'd been trained to react with force on the battlefield. Here at home, any small frustration, an empty bait trap, a misguided customer complaint, became grounds for brutal lashing out. I learnt to read his moods like weather patterns. A storm was coming if he returned from the swamp with silent shoulders and 100-yard stare. In those moments, Mama would whisper urgently, "Cordelia, get away." I'd slide beneath the loose plank in our bedroom floor. Curling into the tight hollow, Mama crafted for me my sanctuary and my prison. From that dark pocket, I could hear everything. The heavy thud of his boots, the slam of the screen door, his slurred curses. Each confrontation was a gamble. Sometimes he'd break something and stride off in shame. Other times he'd find Mama or me and unleash a fury that would echo through the cypress trees. I didn't understand until decades later that this was domestic violence, an assertion of power over the most vulnerable. In the mid-20th century, married women were legally bound to their husbands in many states. Fleeing abuse could mean losing custody of one's children or being shunned by the church. For Daddy, the fury he stoked with every swing of his fist reinforced a twisted sense of patriarchal rightness. The battered wife, the cowering child were cheap proof of his authority. It took a long time for any caring adult beyond our cabin to notice. Once a teacher at Folkestone Elementary asked me about the purple bruise on my arm. I told her I'd banged into the desk. Later, I learned that school counselors today receive training to spot signs of abuse, unexplained injuries, chronic absences, a child's hypervigilance. But in that era, no protocol existed. The unspoken rule was to mind your own business. The tragedy is that even as we endured, other families shared the same hidden hell. I later met Alice, whose father returned from Europe with pipe bombs and stared at his family through game bag goggles, convinced enemy snipers were hiding behind magnolia trees. She recalled lying in her closet with a makeshift pillow over her head to muffle the screams. On the surface, her home was respectable Sunday best at church PTA meetings, a neat yard, but behind closed doors, fear ruled. Like us, they survived by silence and lies. By the time I turned 16, I'd memorized every tight space in our cabin. My mother's arms bore the deeper scars, bruises swimming in the summer heat, but mine were lighter learned second-hand as I absorbed her terror. She seldom spoke of it, and when she did, it came cloaked in guilt. "I'm sorry you have to see this, baby." The unspoken message was clear. Protection meant silence. Yet even in that darkness, small lights flickered. Mama taught me to weave sweetgrass in stolen moments between cycles of violence, her calm voice guiding my fingers as trauma swirled around us. I found solace in the swamp's own cycles, the reliable bobbing of a fishing cork, the nightly chorus of frogs, the steady migration of snow geese overhead in winter. Nature's constancy reminded me that chaos was not the only force at work in the world. Still, the deeper lesson was this: unchecked trauma wreaks havoc across generations. Today's veterans support networks, from veteran peer support groups to telehealth counseling, exist precisely because experiences like mine became too common to ignore. In our cabin, we had none of that. We had only each other and a code of stoic survival that nearly broke us. If there is a bright line in our story, it comes with the awareness that early warning signs need not be shrugged off. Recognizing the shift from sadness to rage, offering intervention before abuse, escalates. And knowing there are hotlines like the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233 or the Veterans Crisis Line at 988. Then press 1 can mean the difference between life and death. In 1950s Georgia, I didn't even know such help existed. By the end of that decade, I was determined to change that for Mama, for myself, and for any child who needed to know that suffering need not be a life sentence. As the seasons turned and I grew into a teenager, the need for escape became undeniable. But first, I had to understand the forces that bound us. A father broken by war, a mother silenced by fear, a community blind to its own code of secrecy. In the next part of our journey, we will witness the moment my childhood sanctuary under the floorboards gave way to an act of defiance, an act that would shatter the confines of our silence and set us on the path toward freedom. I learned early that the smallest sounds could mean the difference between safety and disaster. The soft creak of a loose floorboard, the rustle of Mama's skirt as she tiptoed toward the kitchen, the distant echo of Daddy's boots on the porch boards, all became part of the vocabulary of my fear. I would slip beneath that hollow under the floor, curled like a pill-bug, and press my ears against the rough-hewn planks to catch every nuance. Darkness was my ally, silence my shield. From that hidden pocket, I witnessed more than a child ever should. Yet secrecy carries a burden of its own. Hiding taught me vigilance, but it also taught me shame. I believed that pain was mine alone to bear, that asking for help was a betrayal of my family's code. In small rural communities, there is a powerful bystander effect. Neighbors see bruises, but look away. Teachers notice absences, but accept the story of sick days. We internalize that silence and pass it down, generation to generation. Even as I grew older, the habit of quiet compliance clung to me like Spanish moss in the treetops. And then came the night that changed everything. It was late summer of 1952, and a thunderstorm had rolled in, churning the swamp into a roiling, echoing cathedral of sound. Rain pounded the cabin roof in furious sheets, and lightning split the sky into white-hot veins. Daddy's boat was tied at the dock. He hadn't been able to fish or sell bait all week, and the tension in the cabin was as thick as the humid air. I was in my hiding spot when I heard Mama's scream, sharp, terrified, unlike the muffled cries I'd heard before. The sound sliced through the patter of rain, and something inside me snapped awake. I pressed my palms against the plank above, heart hammering, expecting the floor to shudder under the weight of his rage. Instead, there was an eerie hush, as if even the storm itself paused to listen. And that moment of suspended breath was a summons. But years of fear told me to stay silent, to remain small and hidden. Therefore I did the unthinkable. I pushed the loose plank aside and climbed out. Those first seconds were surreal. I blinked against the darkness, rain seeping through the gaps, and found myself staring at Daddy, looming over Mama's still form. His hand gripped her arm with a force that defied mercy. The broken bottle he'd thrown lay shards of glass in the scattered lamplight. Blood mixed with mud at Mama's feet. I froze. Part of me wanted to crawl back beneath the floor and vanish. But another part, one I barely knew, roared to life. I spotted the cast iron skillet hanging on a nail by the hearth, its heavy weight solid with possibility. My trembling hand closed around its cool handle. I remember the moment in crystal clarity. The swing, the sickening thud as metal met flesh, the spray of blood against the faded linoleum. And then Daddy's eyes, wide, uncomprehending, and suddenly mortal. He staggered back, clutching the side of his head, the bottle of whiskey slipping from his other hand. He sank to his knees, dazed. And in that moment the world shifted. The power dynamic inverted. The monster that had haunted our nights lay vulnerable on the floor. Real-life parallels shine bright against such a moment. In 2018, a woman named Marisol Delgado in rural Texas found herself cornered by her abuser in her kitchen late one night. She grabbed a rolling pin and, with the same mixture of fear and resolve, struck him to save her children. Marisol later founded Kitchen Courage, a non-profit offering self-defense training and legal aid to survivors in remote communities. Her story, like mine, underscores a vital truth. When institutional help is absent, ordinary objects become tools of survival, and terror can catalyze extraordinary courage. I stood over him, chest heaving, as Mama rose to her feet, eyes glazed with shock and relief. She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, grounding me. In that silent exchange, we agreed we would no longer hide. But the aftermath was a tangle of confusion and fear. Breaking the silence meant facing consequences we didn't fully understand. Would the neighbors hear? Would the sheriff arrive and demand we explain ourselves? In 1952, Georgia assault accusations against a wife-beater were rare. More often, the victim was blamed for provoking the violence. Yet the law offered no refuge to the abused, and false witness against one's own father seemed impossible. We moved swiftly. Mama tended to the gash on Daddy's temple with clean cloths and whispered assurances that he'd be all right. By morning, he was incoherent with a concussion, and we used the confusion to slip away barefoot through the mud, guided by the battered shapes of cypress knees toward a new life. But it was the psychological turning point that mattered most. No longer could I believe that silence was safety. I discovered that confronting abuse, no matter how terrifying, was the first step toward reclaiming agency. Psychologists now recognize this pattern. Victims often experience a window of tolerance during a crisis, where the adrenaline-fueled clarity enables them to act decisively. Years of trauma become distilled into a moment of undeniable choice: stay or fight back. that choice wasn't easy. In the months that followed, my nightmares morphed from hiding to fighting, and I grappled with guilt. Guilt for harming the man I still called Daddy. Guilt for leaving our home behind. Many survivors of domestic violence navigate this complex emotional landscape. The knowledge that violence begets more questions than answers. The fear that fleeing is abandoned the question of, am I betraying my family? It took time, counsel, and community for me to understand that self-preservation is no betrayal. It is a fundamental right. Mama and I found refuge with the carpenter's neighbors, turned allies, who helped us navigate the fallout. Their compassion was the antithesis of the isolation we'd known. When Mrs. Carpenter held my mother while she wept, offering tea and quiet solidarity, I realized that shame dissolves in shared sorrow. It was the opposite of silence it was speaking, acknowledging and trusting someone else with our story. Yet even as we rebuilt, I saw the common pitfalls survivors face. Some cling to the idea that simply leaving an abusive environment ends the trauma. But the psychological scars run deep. PTSD doesn't pause at the doorstep of a new home. Mama's trembling hands, my hypervigilant startle response at sudden noises, these persisted. True healing required not just physical escape, but emotional support therapy, peer groups, and deliberate practices to reorient our nervous systems from fight or flight to peace. Research today confirms what I learned firsthand. Survivor circles, peer-led support groups offer a potent remedy. Sitting in a circle hearing women share stories that echo your own being met with nods and tears instead of disbelief. It rewires the brain's threat response, replacing isolation with community safety. I attended my first circle in Baltimore years later and found that the same forces that once silenced me could now empower me. My story of breaking the silence is not unique, but its lessons are universal. Read the signs. Notice the shift from tension to violence. Patterns repeat until confronted. Find your moment. Even amid fear, there will be a fleeting instant where resolve crystallizes. Recognize it. Seek solidarity. Shame clamors in solitude. Healing begins in trusted community. If domestic violence remains hidden, it thrives. But when a single voice breaks the hush, it can resonate across generations. The skillet in my hand became more than a hunk of iron. It became a symbol of agency. Marisol Delgado's rolling pin became a beacon for others to reclaim their power. Their examples like mine remind us that confrontations, whether physical, emotional, or legal, is not about defeating another person, but about defeating the fear that binds you. In sharing this part of our journey, I hope you see that courage often arrives wrapped in desperation. You may not need a skillet or rolling pin, but you do need allies, trusted friends, community organization trained counselors. If you or someone you know faces violence, reach out. The National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-7233, and local shelters stand ready to break the silence with you. Our flight from the swamp was only the beginning. In the next chapter, we will explore how Mama and I navigated life beyond Georgia. How healing truly began when we stepped into the unknown, armed with nothing but our shared resolve, and the knowledge that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak up. Mama and I arrived in Baltimore on a crisp autumn morning, the city's skyline a jagged promise above the harbor. Its air smelled of salt and diesel and possibility so different from the humid stillness of the swamp. When Judith Sharon's sister guided us off the bus and into the women's shelter, a converted brownstone painted a hopeful dove grey. I felt the weight of our journey settle onto my shoulders. For the first time, safety wasn't measured by who could see our bruises, but by locked doors and trained staff who understood that violence lived in many forms. The first nights were the hardest. Mama flinched at every slamming screen door. Her dreams were haunted by thunder so deep it rattled her bones. I slept with my coat buttoned ready to dash beneath an imaginary floorboard. At breakfast in the shelter's dining room, I watched other women, some with children, some alone, tracing those same shadows in their eyes. Mrs. Redding, the shelter's counselor, greeted us gently, her voice steadier than my racing thoughts. "This is a place to start over," she said. "We'll help you find your voice again." Those words had felt foreign until I heard them aloud. In Georgia, speaking up had been an act of betrayal. Here, every sentence I spoke carried the power to reshape my life. The shelter offered group sessions 3 times a week, survivor circles as they called them, where each woman took a turn speaking her truth. I remember my hands shaking as I introduced myself. "I'm Cordelia Beauchamp, and I'm learning what it means to be safe." The room fell silent, not in judgment, but in solidarity. And when the other women nodded and whispered their welcomes, I felt a tremor of hope ripple through me. Healing is not linear, and our first steps were jagged. Mama refused to leave her room for days, claiming her bones ached too much. I coaxed her with soup and soft hymns she once sang at our Baptist church. I helped her stitch her own quilt, a patchwork of floral feedsack scraps, so she could feel her hands creating warmth again rather than weaving baskets in secret. Slowly, her curiosity returned. She began to wander the shelter's small garden, touching the rough bark of an azalea bush, marveling at its pink blooms. When she laughed the first time at a stray cat weaving between our legs, I knew the silence was thawing. As I watched my mother learn independence, I embarked on my own path of empowerment education. Judith had told me about the community college downtown, and though I hadn't been in school since high school graduation, I felt a spark I hadn't known since my earliest days weaving with Mama. On the first night of night classes, I sat at a wooden desk under fluorescent lights, surrounded by students half my age. Algebra felt like a foreign language. I'd missed the days of penmanship and poetry replaced by equations and essays. When Professor Linwood introduced himself, he spoke of mathematics like it was music, each variable a note, each formula a song. Something clicked. I realized that learning could be a kind of healing, a way to retrain my mind to focus on possibility instead of fear. I struggled at first. Homework piled up between my waitressing shifts at the diner near the harbour. My hands, calloused from years of shelling peas in a Georgia kitchen, trembled over the typewriter as I wrestled an English composition into shape. But every assignment I completed, every quiz I passed, wove a new thread into my identity, not just as a survivor, but as a student, as a thinker. The shelter's small scholarship fund helped cover tuition, and I'll never forget the day I found an envelope in my mailbox, my first grant award, enough to cover books. I held those pages like a love letter to my future self. Meanwhile, Mama discovered her own form of empowerment through community. She joined a church choir at the Little Baptist Church just down the block, where she taught Sunday school to young girls. Watching her patience with those children, her gentle smile, her stories of the swamp's blue herons and bullfrogs brought me to tears. She was reclaiming her voice in a place that once felt too loud to bear. Other women at the shelter admired her resilience. They asked her questions about basket weaving, and she taught them to braid sweetgrass in the rec room. Her laughter floating over the hum of sewing machines and whispered confidences. One afternoon, I attended a workshop on peer-led support groups, led by a counselor named Denise, who'd herself survived years of abuse. She explained how sharing stories in a safe space could rewire the brain's threat response mirrors of compassion, replacing the automatic flinch at sudden movement. Denise invited us to pair off and practice active witnessing, holding space for each other's truths. As I looked into the eyes of a woman named Marlene, trembling as she spoke of her father's rage, I felt the same shudder of empathy I once reserved for myself. In that circle, I realized my own story could serve others, that the pain I'd carried so long could transform into a bridge of understanding. Still, the practical demands of daily life loomed large. I balanced schoolwork and shelter activities, but exhaustion visited me in waves. Twice I nearly dropped out, once after a brutal midterm that shattered my confidence, and once after a shift where a rude diner patron reminded me of the disdain I'd felt back in Georgia. Each time I considered letting the burden of my past eclipse my fledgling dreams. But Mama, steady as ever, reminded me, "You couldn't stop then, and you won't stop now." Her words echoed Professor Linwood's encouragement and Denise's reassurance. I persisted, one homework assignment at a time, one community meeting at a time. By spring of 1971, not only had I passed all my classes, I was elected vice president of the Student Support Group for Survivors, an honor I never imagined. We organized a campus exhibit, Art of Resilience, displaying drawings, poems and baskets from women who'd found refuge in the shelter. Mama contributed a basket titled New Beginnings, its sweetgrass strips dyed in colors of dawn. At the exhibit's opening, I watched visitors marvel at the artistry and read the stories behind each piece. I felt a swell of pride that transcended any grade or paycheck. Education had done more than teach me algebra and English. It had rebuilt my sense of self-worth. Where once I measured myself by the absence of violence, now I measured myself by growth, by contributions to a community that valued my voice. The scholarship I'd once feared losing became a testament to perseverance, and I made a promise to help other survivors access education so that no one would have to choose between healing and learning. Our final act in Baltimore came when Mama and I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment of our own. A modest flat above a corner bookstore painted the color of summer lemons. We furnished it with second-hand finds, a rocking chair for me, a wicker love seat for Mama, and a sturdy bookshelf where our weaving materials and textbooks sat side by side. The apartment was ours to fill with laughter and music instead of dread. Mama planted a pot of azalea cuttings on the windowsill, and I draped my graduation gown over the back of her chair. That apartment was more than a roof. It was proof that rebuilding identity is a gentle, persistent labor. Holt's 2019 study on survivor empowerment notes that meaningful milestones like completing a degree or taking a leadership role correlate strongly with long-term recovery. Our lives in Baltimore became testaments to that truth. Every time I walked across the stage in my cap and gown, I wasn't just receiving a diploma. I was validating every small choice that had brought me here, the day I stepped from beneath the floorboards, the night I whispered to Mama that we'd leave the morningses. I dragged myself out of bed to study instead of replaying old nightmares. As summer bled into the city's dog days, I took a walk along the harbour, tracing the same rhythm of tides that once rocked our John boat in Georgia. The water looked familiar in its ebb and flow, reminding me that life, like the swamp's current, moves forward if you learn to navigate its channels. I pulled out my mother's handmade basket, New Beginnings, running my fingers over its dawn-coloured strips, and I knew our resilience was not an endpoint, but a continuous journey. In the next chapter, we will explore how, with renewed confidence and education as our shield, Mama and I reconnected with our roots, both the beauty of the swamp and the trauma it held, and how we used our story to break cycles, build new traditions, and give back to our community. This was our season of empowerment, proof that even after the darkest storms, the human spirit can learn to stand tall again. When Daniel and I welcomed our daughter Rose into the world in March of 1976, I felt a swell of both joy and urgency I'd never known before. Tiny fingers curled around mine, and in that instant I vowed that my children would grow up in a home defined not by fear, but by safety, curiosity, and love. The same sweetgrass baskets Mama once wove became symbols not of survival under duress, but of creativity born from calm, intentional practice. In building our family, I committed to breaking the cycle my father had begun, and I want to share the 5 principles that guided my new parenting approach, grounded in modern positive discipline research. Empathetic listening. Before responding to tears or tantrums, I learned to kneel at Rose's level, make eye contact, and say, "I'm listening. Tell me how you feel." Psychologists today confirm that naming emotions helps children regulate them and makes them feel genuinely heard. Choice within structure. Rather than commanding, "Do as I say," I offered limited choices. "Would you like apple slices or banana with your snack?" This small measure of autonomy teaches decision-making without overwhelming a child unaccustomed to any control. Natural consequences over punishment. When Thomas spilled his milk instead of scolding, I showed him how to clean it up and let him feel the minor discomfort of cold milk on his toes. Experiencing natural outcomes instills responsibility more effectively than arbitrary punishment. Consistent rituals for security. We crafted nightly rituals, reading under a quilt of hand-stitched squares, saying 3 things we were thankful for, and a gentle back rub before lights out. Consistency became a balm anchoring my children in predictable love. Modeling calm. Conflict resolution. Daniel and I practiced respectful disagreement in front of Rose and Thomas, showing them how to apologize, communicate needs, and find compromise. Children who witness adults managing tension with kindness are far less likely to resort to aggression themselves. These shifts didn't come overnight. There were days when old habits resurfaced, my voice rising too sharply, my patience thinning in the face of sibling squabbles. But every misstep became an opportunity to apologize and reset, demonstrating humility and repair rather than perfection. In 1984, I felt the pull of the swamp once more and arranged a trip back to the Okefenokee. I wanted our children to know the landscape of their grandmother's childhood, the spongy boardwalks, the thick cypress knees thrusting skyward, the smoky scent of burnt marsh grass at dusk. We traveled with a local eco-tour guide, Jamal Rivers, whose family had been stewards of the swamp for generations. He took us on an airboat at sunrise, and I listened as he spoke of water quality monitoring and invasive species management. How conserving these wetlands protected not just wildlife, but nearby communities from flooding and erosion. "Your mother's baskets," Jamal said, hoisting a coil of sweetgrass, are part of this ecosystem story. They're made from marsh plants that clean the water around us. In that moment, I realized our family's legacy extended beyond trauma. It entwined with the rhythms of the earth itself. I told Rose and Thomas, "Every basket you see here is like a thread in a tapestry. It's history, culture, and hope woven all at once." That trip taught us that reconnecting with our roots can be a powerful act of healing and environmental stewardship. Back home in Baltimore, Mama's health had begun to fade. Her laughter slower, her hands knotted with arthritis. Yet she remained a force of love, teaching my grandchildren the art of sweetgrass weaving during Sunday visits. Those afternoons were less about perfect techniques and more about presence, the feel of pliant grass between young fingers. The shared silence as we listened to the harbor's gulls. We were building new traditions, rituals of creation, replacing the old rituals of hiding. One of my proudest moments came when Rose, now a college student studying social work, organized an annual Healing Harvest event at the community garden near our apartment. Each October, survivors and allies gathered to braid sweetgrass plant native bulbs and share stories over steaming mugs of ginger tea. We called it Healing Harvest because it celebrated growth from broken seeds, an apt metaphor for our collective journeys. What began as a dozen participants swelled to hundreds, offering healing rituals for anyone who'd known violence, loss, or displacement. Along the way, I saw common pitfalls many survivors face. Some cling to independence so fiercely that they reject help, convinced that vulnerability is weakness. Others fall into survivor guilt, believing they don't deserve happiness when loved ones continue to struggle. To guard against these traps, I adopted 3 practices I recommend to any survivor. Regular peer check-ins. I schedule a weekly coffee with a trusted friend or support group member. When one of us stumbles, the other is there to say, "I see you, you don't walk this alone." Mindful rituals. Whether it's sunrise yoga on the deck or lighting a candle when I write in my journal, I choose small daily acts that reinforce peace rather than fear. Service as healing. Volunteering at the domestic violence hotline reminded me that my story could guide another person towards safety. Giving back turned my past pain into a beacon for someone else. Ultimately, the choices we make every day define us more than our hardest trials. Healing is not a destination, but a path we walk with intention, choosing empathy over anger, repair over blame, and growth over stagnation. Now at 83, I sit on my porch in the soft, amber glow of evening, rocking gently as my grandchildren chase fireflies among the azalea bushes. The wind carries whispers of cicadas and distant church bells. Every so often, I run my fingers along the basket I carry in my lap. Hand-woven strips dyed the color of dawn to remind me that we are all works in progress, weaving our own stories one strand at a time. If my journey offers any message, it is this: no one is defined by what was done to them, but by the choices they make afterward. If you're a survivor or know someone who is, remember 3 steps you can take right now. Reach out. Call a trusted friend or hotline, 1-800-799-7233, and say, "I need someone to talk to." Claim a ritual. Find one small daily act, watering a plant, writing a note of gratitude that grounds you in care. Offer a hand. Volunteer, mentor, or simply listen. Sometimes the best way to heal is to help another carry their burden. In breaking the cycle of violence, we forge a legacy of love. We teach our children that courage is not the absence of fear, but the resolve to keep walking toward light, even when the path seems dark. And by sharing our stories, we create ripples of resilience that can reach farther than any secret ever could.